Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, with a question for you in regards to your DNA. That's right, your DNA. You sent it off to 23andMe. You got the report back. You were so thrilled as to who you actually were from a genetics perspective related to this group or that group. And, you know, you and your family and friends are really the only one who cared about that, except maybe somebody else who you didn't want to know really cares about it much more than you do. And that is Satan himself, who wants to know if you have a particular Y chromosome marker that says that you're in the line of Aaron. What could he possibly do with that? Well, there are efforts around the world, over 40 countries involved in the weaponization of DNA to take out a particular race or group of people that have a particular genetic marker. Oh, don't be so shocked. This was the agenda of Iran, naming itself Iran instead of Persia, to become an Aryan nation, to create a Shiite country. Don't be so surprised that Adolf Hitler was trying to create the perfect person. Don't even be shocked that the word ethnos comes from the word, or in English is ethnic, and it was the Greeks trying to perfect the perfect person in Adonis. And Satan wants to take out this line of the Y chromosome that identifies you in the line of Aaron, the high priest, because until the high priest takes up his rightful place in the bloodline of Aaron, Jesus doesn't come back and Satan rules the earth. That's the storyline behind the Codist, out in paperback and Kindle special, $2.99. I also want to encourage you to visit our website at ConnectingANation.com. Click on the special offers, and you're going to find a cover of this yellow book, The 7 Laws of Abundant Living, Lessons Learned from the Tree of Light. Click on the book cover. We're going to ask you for your email address. We won't send you spam because spam is not kosher, but we will send you the first chapter of this book for free as we take you on a journey from the natural into the supernatural. 7 laws, 7 lessons, right there in the Garden of Eden, the tree of life, beginning with the ground out to the fruit. Get your copy today wherever great Christian books are sold. It's my pleasure to welcome, as we do on the last Monday of every month at 10 o'clock a.m. Central Time for the Caregiver Hour, Peter Rosenberger, an exceptional voice of experience for an unprecedented need. For more than 30 years, Peter has personally traveled the path of the family caregiver. Through this journey, Peter's discovered a caregiver can not only survive, but thrive in oftentimes grim circumstances. In an unparalleled journey with his wife, Gracie, Peter has navigated a medical nightmare that has mushroomed to over 80 major operations, including the amputation of both Gracie's legs below the knee. These difficult experiences led Peter to work with more than 80 treating physicians in 12 hospitals, 7 medical insurance companies, and medical bills soaring to well more than $10 million. All these circumstances resulted in Peter developing a firm grasp of the health care issues faced by families with disabilities. Since 2013, he has carried his message of help and hope for the caregiver to the airways, hosting his own weekly show on iHeartMedia's News Channel 1510, WLAC in Nashville, Tennessee. In September 2017, Peter took his radio show into syndication through the Truth Network. In addition, his Caregiver Minute it's featured on more than 380 stations. He has 4 books, including Hope for the Caregiver and 7 Caregiver Landmines and How You Can Avoid Them. Peter Rosenberger, welcome to this edition of the Caregivers Hour, hosted by none other than Peter Rosenberger.
Well, listen, thank you for that intro. I'm sorry it ate up so much of your real estate on your show, but thank you for that.
Well, we want people to know who you are and the value. Just the other day, we interviewed a good friend of yours, Kathy Howard. And yes. Kathy had been on your program with you, and we were talking about the 43, 46 million caregivers there are, adult caregivers that there are in this country, and how little of our media attention, how little of our resources are made overtly available to them. And the message of the caregiver seems to be one that is kind of pushed to the background. Nobody wants to talk about it. Nobody wants to face us, but it impacts a tremendous amount of the population of America, and they seem to be just suffering in silence. You, of course, are bringing a voice, a clarion call that says we need to address this as an issue both from the care receiver, but really for the mental health, the emotional health, the spiritual health of the caregiver.
Well, if the caregiver's not in a good place, how's that impact the patient, the loved one? They're at risk on multiple levels, and then they are depending on this one individual. It's usually one primary individual. Sometimes there's a group of folks, but usually it's always one. And if that person is in a bad place financially, physically, morally, spiritually, professionally, you're basically sitting on a time bomb. It's only a matter of time before this thing really descends into a Greek tragedy. And I tell my fellow caregivers, we're always one sprained ankle away from this thing really going south, because the ecosystem is that fragile. And that brings me to a topic today that you and I have been discussing offline, and now we're gonna share it with your listeners on an issue that's creeping into the fabric of our society. While society, I get the feeling, Eric, that there's a bait and switch going on, and then there's 3-card Monte thing going on, where if we keep everybody distracted with Stormy Daniels and this and this and this, then the real agenda gets pushed through. That's a theory I've been working on. And it's not saying that all these other things aren't important, but we as believers need to be vigilant and incredibly aware of what's going on. I was watching the Charles Krauthammer special celebrating his life, and I have an enormous amount of respect for him as a thinker and what he did. And he said, he went back and studied, when the Germans, in a matter of just a few years or even less, destroyed vast amounts of history and culture. And the Chinese did the same thing when the communists took over, and they destroyed 1,000 years worth of things. And he said, when you get the politics wrong, it has massive implications. And I've been watching the fabric of our society, and I don't think anybody can argue with the fact that we're getting the politics wrong in this country. I mean, we've descended into a country that is just screaming at each other. And in the process, things are getting into our societal DNA that are causing bad problems. And one of these is this whole argument of medically assisted suicide and taking yourself out when it gets to be a point. And I've been watching this unfold. And so with your permission, I'd like to just delve into this today.
Well, the politically, ping pong ball, they're calling it death with dignity laws. And you and I spoke the other day, and we both agreed it's assisted suicide. We both agreed from a biblical worldview that not only is it assisted suicide, but in many cases these medications have to be administered legally by a caregiver who is taking the life of another, and that then borderlines on whether or not it's assisted suicide or is it manslaughter. And
well, it concerns me a couple things. One of the term death with dignity, I think I was watching an old episode of House, the television show, and there's one scene where he said, there's nothing dignified about death. And we have a Savior who hates death, so much so that he bore the ultimate penalty of that death. I don't think that, I think we throw these words like death with dignity around, and compassion and merciful and all that kind of stuff. And I understand the sentiment and all that. And I have to put that on this particular box over here, put that in that box. And let me talk about what you just mentioned, is that so many of these things, like Hawaii passed this thing of our choice, our Care Act or something to that effect, where there's a physician assisted death, medically assisted death, where physicians will provide lethal drugs to this patient in need, but they have to go through a psychiatric evaluation, and then they have to have, which is interesting because if somebody attempts suicide and fails, they have to have a psychiatric evaluation. Now they're doing one if you're wanting to commit suicide to do it. So it's kind of interesting on that. And then they have to be less than 6 months to live, and so forth and so on. But in nowhere did we see in the legislation of that where there was any type of psychiatric requirement or evaluation for the caregiver who would have to administer, because physicians aren't going to administer this. So I'm left with several questions, and this may get a little gnarly to get through, but if you'll bear with me, my first question is, why does the state need to codify this? You see, suicide is always an option for anybody. Anybody can take themselves out at any point. The only impediment to suicide is an innate moral boundary that's only shifted by impairment, disease, or societal manipulation. So why does the state need to codify this? That's a big question for me. Why the rush to codify this? If you want to take yourself out, what's stopping you from doing this? And if you are depending on somebody else to help you do it, then why is that person's needs not addressed in this legislation? And so those are things that I think that need to be discussed and just asked questions for. Why do we need to do this? And then what is the signal that we're sending when we're saying that it's okay when suffering gets to be too much for you to take yourself out and you've got 6 months to live? Well, why 6 months? That's an arbitrary number. Why 6 months? Why not 5 months and 13 days? Why not 7 months and 12 days? And if society can establish that number that we can wrap our heads around, that we make, okay, he's only got 6 months to live, then it's okay. Well, then what's to stop society from saying he's only got 1 year to live, or 2 years to live, or he shouldn't have to live like this? And that's when I start raising a few red flags. Wait a minute, who are making these arbitrary numbers when half of the Earth's travel around the sun is all you have left? Then it's okay for you to die. To me, that seems arbitrary, and death is not arbitrary. And this is a final solution with an arbitrary number thrown at it. And I watch these celebrities, have they taken themselves out recently through mental illness or whatever's going on with them. Whereas I look at somebody like Charles Krauthammer, who faced quadriplegia and everything else he did with enormous amount of dignity and enormous amount of courage, and accepted that this was going to go out, but he didn't try to take himself out. He simply got the news from the doctor and got his affairs in order and did what, let it take its course. But why is this rush to codify medically assisted death? And that's a question I have.
Well, I'm in complete agreement with you. When you and I talked about the subject and I began doing research in it, excuse me, the way this works is that you go through this process. And the process is whether or not the medication is given to you, and the doctor then provides the medication and someone has to administer it. Well, as you and I both know, that in many cases of caregiving, the determination of dementia or mental impairment, the individual is not able to express themselves clearly. They may be in a certain debilitated state, but regardless, all these laws, rules, and regulations, especially for the states which have adopted them, California, Colorado, District of Columbia, Oregon, Vermont, and Washington, Hawaii, and now Montana. And Montana was determined to be legal by the state Supreme Court in Montana for the last almost 10 years. They give you the medication, but then you're required to take it. And if you're required to take it, then if you're given 6 months left to live, according to what man's standard is, then the caregiver is now involved in this process. They know that lethal medication is available. the opportunity is ripe with abuse. It's ripe with how does a caregiver such as yourself, who for 30 years administered by the side of his wife, now all of a sudden become executioner? And
there's no provision to counsel the caregiver. There's no provision to deal with this, and they're thinking, well, you're being compassionate. Well, are you? That people are very free who have not done what I've done to say I'm being compassionate. If I have to watch somebody suffer for 30 years, well, you're being compassionate. I don't know that that's an accurate term, and I know that there's tragic circumstances out there. I've seen them and I've watched them. I've watched it in my own family. However, again, I saw this rush to allow permission for people to take their own lives if the suffering is great enough and there's only 6 months left to live. But I didn't see this rush to in any way provide for the emotional needs of these individuals who are going to be doing this on behalf of somebody they've cared for, number one. And number two, what signal are we sending to society that says that we have now established that there is a line that if we and you think the suffering is too great, you can go ahead and kill yourself? Now, do you remember that series that Francis Schaeffer did with C. Everett Koop back in the 70s, Whatever Happened to the Human Race?
No.
Do yourself a favor and go back and look at it, because it is incredibly telling. Once we start devaluing what life is, and we did that back in 1973 in a horrific manner. Once we start doing that, and by the way, we were no stranger to that. We just simply made it a medical procedure. This has been going on since the fires of Moloch. And that one I know you do know, because this has been going on for a long time. But once we start devaluing as a society, or determining we get to tell you when life is and when life is not, then it's only a series of steps before we're in a very horrific place. And so what you're saying is there's a level of suffering that we've determined that if your life expectancy is less than 6 months, 1/2 rotation around the sun, then it's okay for you to go ahead and check out on your own terms. How long does it take before you get to a point where you are saying, well, 7 months. All right, we'll allow 7 months, or 8 months, or a year, or whatever. Who's making these arbitrary numbers? I remember I asked one time the head of a large denomination years and years ago, I said, are you guys going to provide a sacrament for gay marriage? And they said, oh, no, I don't think we're going to go that far, because they were already allowing gay priests and so forth. I said, oh, I don't think we're going to go that far. And this was a pretty high up official in that denomination. And I said, so you've absolved them of homosexuality, but you've condemned them to adultery and fornication. And the look on their face was just truly stunning, because they hadn't thought about the implications of what they were doing. They were knee-jerking and having these unintended consequences. And I think one of the unintended consequences of this particular act is that we are devaluing life and saying that it's okay if you suffer enough that there is a provision for you to go ahead and kill yourself. And I say to you that I've watched somebody who suffered extremely, who is living a life of great meaning and purpose. In August, Gracie is traveling with us at considerable challenges to herself over to West Africa, where we'll continue our prosthetic limb outreach, where she is providing, this was her vision when she gave up her legs, prosthetic limbs to her fellow amputees as a means of equipping them to stand with hope in Jesus Christ. That's the name of our ministry, Standing with Hope. And she is in pain all the time. She's missing both legs. You read off her resume of suffering at the beginning of this. So a lot of people say, I wouldn't want to live as a double amputee in pain for 35 years. And now the state is saying that if the pain is great enough at this level, we'll allow you to go ahead and kill yourself. Now, I don't understand why the state feels they need to allow somebody to kill themselves or not. If they succeed, you can't punish them. If they fail, you put them in a psychiatric hospital. So I don't understand why there's this rush to codify something like this, other than there's this there's this misguided compassion and a sense of a worldview of life that I think is very alarming to me. That's just me.
Peter, as I listen to your opinions and your views on this, knowing that you are deeply entrenched in it and a spokesperson for it, I can't even imagine somebody getting having a terminal illness and having a calendar where they're putting X's on the countdown to the magic number of 6 months, and that, today is my day I can go to the doctor and it's legal for me to make this request. There are people who will, the caregiver, look at this as an opportunity to say, you know what, I'm suffering as a caregiver. I've had enough caregiving. This is what I signed up for, long-term care where I have no life outside of this caregiving. It consumes me 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Now that I know it's available, I'm going to start talking about that as an option and be able to convince my mother, my sister, my cousin, my father, my wife, my child, that, maybe this is a better way. Maybe this is a way for you to ease your pain. Maybe since now that they are saying, listen, this is okay, and they're blessing it. Maybe it's
this is compassionate,
right? And maybe this is an option we should consider. I can't imagine the patient who has fought this fight, if they are truly at the point where their body is cancer-ridden, where their body is shutting down, where the best prognosis is 6 months, then they have palliative care. There is hospice available to them. There is a way to allow them to have this dignity. But legislating the end of life as another option sounds to me like another form of abortion. It's just late-term abortion. Really late-term abortion.
Well, I think that, again, it's all couched in compassion. I think the option is always there to take yourself out. I believe this. We all think about this in suffering in life or whatever, that, wouldn't it be better just to welcome the sweet release of death? If suffering gets hard enough and painful enough and we just wish we could just whatever. However, what I would like to insert is the option of life. The option of life in beauty in the midst of suffering. And I look through all of Scripture and history that I can see, and you always see extraordinary moments of human dignity and courage in the face of horrific suffering, from concentration camps to hospital wards. Go back and look at Elie Wiesel's book. There's always something that sparks something greater in the human soul, and that's that part of us that we were created in the image of God, and if we are willing to slip our scared hand into his scarred hand and trust that there may be more to what we're dealing with, and even this cancer, even this Lou Gehrig's disease, even this chronic pain, all these things. And I think that we as believers can insert a different option in this. We can insert a different viewpoint than just this, we just resign to death with dignity. How about life with dignity?
Well, I completely agree with you. We're talking with Peter Rosenberger, website caregiverswithhope.com, and their ministry of providing rebuilt, donated prosthetics and taking them to Africa in a trip coming up soon to fit a number of amputees throughout Africa with prosthetic limbs that are rebuilt and collected and repurposed because of Gracie's vision to use her circumstances, which certainly through as many operations as she's been through, as much pain as she's endured, and Peter right by her side, wishing there was something that he could do, praying that there was something he could do. But instead, God has turned their mourning into dancing. He's turned their ashes in their weeping into laughter, and they are making the best for the kingdom of the worst situations possible. Imagine now somebody coming along and giving you the easy way out, and you squaring off with God and saying, I know better when the life of the loved one that I care for should be terminated. Or you feel like you know better. This is what suicide is. This is what the end of life is telling God that His timing is not perfect, that His plans are not perfect, and that your plans trump His plans, and now you have the legal basis in order to end a life. Is this really what God has planned for you? Is this what God has planned for your loved one? Or is there hope for the caregiver? Is there someone, somewhere, somehow support for you to find the comfort, to find the peace, to find the rest, to find the restoration, to be able to provide adequate health care to one where the possibility of terminating a life early does not even come into the conversation? That, my friends, is dignity. That, my friends, is God's plan. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to continue in this discussion with Peter Rosenberger, caregiver extraordinaire, author of several books, and with his wife Gracie, a number of CDs for hope for the caregiver. On this Caregivers Hour, we'll be right back. Shalom. I'm the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, Executive Director of Igniting a Nation and host of the daily TV program Revealing the Truth, seen live every Monday through Friday from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. Central Standard Time at www.ianbn.com, and then replayed throughout the day and night via our website. All of our segments can be seen on the Igniting a Nation YouTube channel. Since our launch in January of this year, we've expanded our global reach to over 54 countries with a social media following of over 125,000. Our commitment is to bring you the most in-depth interviews with authors, subject matter experts, and thought leaders from around the world. We have interviewed guests from Israel, Brazil, England, India, and all across North America. All of our authors are featured on the Books and Media page on our website, www.ianbn.com. There you can find a direct link to the book you want to order, and we receive a small commission directly from Amazon. There is no cost to you for this service. In addition to our daily teachings and interviews, we make available to you the archive of all of the interviews on our YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram channels. Our live program is available from our homepage, and there is never a charge to you for any of this access. We made the decision long ago that we would remain a commercial-free resource that would not be influenced by any pressure from any outside company. There are only two ways that we are able to continue to operate this ministry and provide you with the only live 4-hour daily Christian television talk show program. The first is through your support and tax-deductible contributions to Igniting a Nation. These can be made directly through the donate button on the website or sent through the mail to Igniting a Nation, 2700 Corporate Drive, Suite 120, Birmingham, Alabama, 35242. The other way we support the program is by offering you a unique opportunity to have access to over 10 years worth of teachings on a subscription basis. The teaching archives contains all of my prior sermons, Torah studies, prophecy in the news videos, and much more for the low subscription price of $5 per month. This subscription grants you unlimited access to over 800 hours of content not available elsewhere, and is updated weekly with the most current prophecy classes. In addition to 20 hours of original TV programming each weekday, we invite you to join us live every Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday evenings for our Prophecy in the News classes. The times and locations are listed on our events page on the website www.ianbn.com. Every day, you and I are faced with the challenge of where we will go to hear the truth. We are committed to bring you the only program of its kind that covers the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. We cannot do this without your support. Since we launched on January 5th, 2017, we have aired over 300 individual teachings, interviews, and commentaries not available anywhere else. We are now working side by side with almost every major Christian publishing house to to bring you the most in-depth feature interviews possible. Our one-hour features address every subject that affects the believer's life. We are hearing of salvations from the Middle East, Africa, and all across the United States. Lives are being changed every day, and we have only just begun. Our mission is to become your trusted resource and grant you access to the people, tools, and information you need to grow in your relationship with the Lord. You can help us by liking us on social media and through your financial support. We know you have many choices in who you support, but we are prayerfully asking you to consider helping us keep revealing the truth, true to our calling, to cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth like no other program available. Donate today and help us bring the message to the four corners of the earth. Visit www.ianbn.com and donate, buy a book, or subscribe to our teaching archives. Without you, we do not exist. Shalom and welcome back to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker. And as we do on the last Monday of every month in the 10 o'clock hour, we have the Caregivers Hour with my co-host, and really I try to defer to him as the host, Peter Rosenberger, who has written 4 books and many CDs and has experienced 35 years of caregiving and is our go-to resource on this matter. Peter, welcome back to the program.
Well, thank you, and thanks for taking the time on this. This is a difficult subject we're talking about, but it's affecting people profoundly, and I think there's more to come. And I think we have sadly set ourselves on a highway that has a tragic end to it. I was watching one time at an award show. There's a group called AC/DC. Are you familiar with them?
I am.
They have a big hit song that they did called "Highway to Hell." And at an award show, they came out and were just rocking the place with this. And the camera panned out to the audience, and they're all fist pumping the air, screaming and shouting and laughing and drinking and everything else, singing "They're on a highway to hell." And I thought, how heartbreaking that people are doing this and they have no idea what they're asking for, proclaiming, and stating with their own mouths. And I think in this situation we have, again, as a society, we are in the context of compassion. We are saying, hey, it's okay for you to take yourself out if somebody's dealing with some kind of terminal illness that they have 6 months to live and yada, yada, yada. They meet all the requirements. Let's go ahead and end it. And we say that this is compassionate, and we toss that word around. But is it not also compassionate to encourage loved ones and remind them of their lives' importance? I mean, to me, that's where the role of a caregiver comes in, is that we can be a source of great comfort and strength and encouragement to individuals, or we can be a voice of curse to them that says, go ahead and end this, be done with it. It'll make it easier on all of us. And I think that's what concerns me about this move to medically assist people taking their own lives who are dealing with some level of terminal infraction. And if you go to them under the context of God says, the Bible says this, well, a lot of them aren't going to believe the Bible. It's hard to trust and believe in a good and loving God, and they're wanting answers. And I think what's happening, Eric, and I'm sorry, I'm just jumping right in. We didn't give a preamble to anybody to coming back from the break, but I figured, well, we'll just jump right into the deep end of the pool. But have you noticed that when we're faced with any kind of tragedy, whether individual, familial, community, or national, it's the same thing. I've watched this with individuals in my own life. I've watched this around in smaller pockets. And then like when 9/11 happens or a shooting in Florida, where is God? And we start asking these why God questions. Why would God allow this? If he's a good and loving God, why should why would he allow this? And why would I even trust him with this? And people want answers, Eric. They want answers, and they want it now. They're demanding answers. Why would God allow 9/11? Why would God allow my loved one to have Huntington's disease? Why would God allow my wife to go through 35 years of pain and have both legs amputated and not do anything about it? Why would God allow Betsy Tim Boone to die in a prison and her father, Casper Tim Boone, to die sitting up against a wall in a hospital corridor somewhere in Nazi Germany? Why would God do this? And I've talked to a lot of apologists who they really want to get, and I don't know if you interact with a lot of guys who are into apologetics, but they tend to be self-styled prophets. I think they want to fashion themselves as John the Baptist type with locusts coming out of their mouth kind of thing, but they tend to be a little bit on the harsh and brash and I think condescending and arrogant side. I think there's a room for apologetics, but I think apologetics should be discussed with weeping, not with pronouncement. And I asked this one guy, I said, well, what would you say to somebody who is suffering? And he said, this is a big old fella, the type. He's brash. He's wearing big old work boots, and his shirt's not really tucked in very well. And he's just big old gruff fella. And he just wants to pound the Bible somewhere. And I said, what would you say to somebody who's suffering? He said, I'd tell him God's sovereign. And I looked at him very measuredly, and I said, that must have been very comforting to Uriah's parents. And it took him a minute to realize what I just said, and he backed up. And that's what I think we as believers can do if we come into these situations with grace and with humility and understanding that we cannot go in there and pronounce stuff into people's suffering, but we can bear their suffering. We can weep with them. And then instead of trying to come up with some kind of answer, that there's no answer that's going to solve this side of heaven. There's nothing that you're going to tell me that's going to make me say, oh, wow, I get it now. Thank you. I feel so much better. It's not going to happen. We don't have the capability to understand these things. And if you look through all of Scripture, God rarely reveals answers to these things. He rarely connects the dots for people.
Two things occur to me during this time. Jason, our executive producer, just a few months ago lost his mom, and she was in the hospital. She was diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia at age 70, mid-70s. And she chose not to have the treatment and go home with hospice. And within 10 days, she passed. God was graceful. The family was all around her up until I was virtually the last person to speak to her. I kissed her on her forehead, prayed over her, released her into the hands of the Lord. She closed her eyes. That was the last time she had a conversation with anyone, and 2 days later, she passed. I begin to think about this assisted living or assisted dying or death with dignity kind of concept, and she went out on her own terms. She made the decision that she wasn't going to endure treatment that wasn't going to give her any kind of future, any kind of chance at the stage of life that she was in. She had raised her children, raised her grandchildren, and was willing to accept whatever the Lord wanted for her, and was not going to go through the pain of chemotherapy, possibility of blood marrow transplants, and die in a hospital bed. She wanted to be with her family. When I look at the requirements for what they require for you to qualify for a prescription, you have to be capable of making and communicating your healthcare decisions, being determined medically competent. Well, if I have dementia, if I have Alzheimer's, if I've already been diagnosed with conditions which require someone else to be in charge of my medical care, then that completely eliminates them. So who is this targeted to that has the mental capacity, has a defined time of life determined for them, and the only thing I can think of are cancer patients who may or may not qualify for surgery or to have been through surgery, and it's an advanced stage, and they're given this very nebulous, quote-unquote, 6-month time frame in which they can then receive this prescription which that has to then be administered either by themselves or by their caregiver. And again, that narrows down the population of those who are receiving caregiving. I have someone who I know that is caregiving for their daughter who has multiple sclerosis and has the intellectual development of a 6-year-old. They haven't been able to make a decision about their health care in their entire life. Therefore, how then can you determine when she has 6 months to live and she can't speak on her own behalf? How many are there of those in our homes being taken care of by family members that are completely excluded from this? So who is this for? And
well, that's a good question. I have a niece that's 30 years old with cerebral palsy, and she's like a 2-year-old. My brother and sister-in-law have been taking care of her for her entire life. She can't make her own decisions. We don't know. They didn't expect her to live. In fact, doctors were certain she wouldn't live to be 30. And here we are. People didn't think Gracie would live. I mean, it looked pretty dicey. My mother has just been in a situation for the last 3 months, and she's still in acute care, dealing with stuff that, it looked pretty dicey there for a while. And so I'm just not really comfortable with states codifying this. I think that when we start allowing legislation by people who do this as a part-time job in state legislators, and they have another profession, and then they're doing this as state legislators, and we allow them to start monkeying around with these kinds of things, we get ourselves in all kinds of messes. Every time the state government and the federal government meet, liberty is encroached upon. Every time these guys meet, they're doing something to restrict our liberty. And doctors and patients can get together and figure out what's best. Doctors give their best recommendation. If a patient doesn't like that, they can seek another opinion and go from there. But at the same time, when the state legislature starts codifying these things, that's when all kinds of alarm bells go off for me. Like, who are these people, and why are they qualified to weigh in on this conversation? Have they watched somebody suffer for 30 years? Have they done this? I don't know that as a body that they haven't. There may be one or two or somebody that has, but as a group, I don't think so. And so I'm thinking, who are these people to do this? And my focus has always been, if the caregiver is in a healthier place, it's going to have a ripple effect into that loved one every single time. We don't know the right answers. In fact, there won't be, as I said earlier, there's not going to be a lot of answers. But here's what we do know as believers. Whereas you could trace all through Scripture, and you can count maybe on one hand where God clearly lays out why he's doing certain things. I mean, It's very rare that he just makes it blatantly obvious. But I can look through the totality of Scripture and see example after example after example where he assures us of his presence. Where we demand answers, he offers assurance. I love that, and I hang on to that. The sovereignty of God is not something that punishes me, that makes me feel despair, that makes me feel comfortable to know that he knows what he's doing. And when I get lost, I look to nail prints in a hand to help guide me, because that is a tangible, complete answer to Huntington's disease, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, quadriplegia, amputation, chronic pain, AIDS, name it. That is the complete answer, is the cross. And when I get so bewildered, which we do as caregivers, when we are dealing with a healthcare nonsense like what I deal with and what Gracie deals with and what so many people I know deal with, you get lost, you get bewildered. And so you have to have things that anchor you and point you to some place. And it is compassionate to speak life in that situation. And that's how we as believers can encourage one another. But we do it with humility. We do it with grace, and we do it with tears, understanding that this broken, fallen world, all creation is groaning out for this. But he gives us the strength to face this, strength for today, bright hope for tomorrow, as the hymn writer said, to look at this stuff And like Betsy Ten Boom said, we're going to be thankful for the fleas because that keeps the guards away so that we can study his scripture and stay firm on this thing. And as Corrie Ten Boom was released, the women behind her were all executed. But she got out. And by the way, she led Gracie to the Lord when Gracie was 6 years old. I don't know if you knew that or not.
I remember you telling me that, yes.
And so we don't know how God connects all these dots. So we trust him. But why do we trust him? Because if he's so good and loving, why does he allow so much suffering? We trust him because of one complete final answer, and that is the cross. That is his answer. Here's why you should trust me. Period. End of discussion. And once we understand the magnificence and the magnitude of the cross, it transcends. It doesn't take it away, but it transcends all this other stuff. And we cling to it with all that we have. And he gives us strength to cling to it even more.
You know, as you talk about this issue, I think we have to follow the money. Like everything else, we have to follow the money. And when we follow the money and we realize that it's doctors and you have to meet with 2 doctors, and it's just another part of this rotation that says that I now have pharmaceutical industries pushing for end-of-life drugs. I now have doctors that have to be involved. There's now a way out for the caregiver if he is an influencer, or he or she is an influencer in this. How do I stop the bleeding of family support? Is it financial? Is it compassion, or is it financial? That's going to be the question. Right, is it expedient? And that's the question that I have, and the question you have, and I both share, is what's it going to do to the caregiver who is going to live with the consequences of this decision for the rest of their life? And
yeah, I don't think that's even on the radar of these people.
Well,
I really don't. I don't think that they're even considering it, Eric.
They're not
taking
mentioned.
up a human life.
They're not mentioned, and it's tantamount to assisted suicide. It is tantamount to Kevorkian, who was all in the media, who wound up relocating, I believe, to Oregon so he could get residency, so that he could have what he wanted was an early termination of his life, because he had advocated for this for so long, assisted suicide, and that's exactly what this is, which is not in, as you and I both, biblical worldview. Suicide is saying that you are now playing God and determining the number of your days. The Bible says, teach us to number our days, but not to put the end number on. Only God can do that. If you think about somebody who 10 years ago might have been facing a debilitating situation, and the caregiver didn't want to wait, and all of a sudden we have these technological and medical breakthroughs that their condition that was terminal 10 years ago is no longer terminal, because they've now developed a process, procedure, and new medicines which can, even 10 years later, bring you into remission and add an extraordinary amount to your life. What if they had had the easy out and it was the legal out? You know, Paul says all things are lawful, but not all things are beneficial. And the fallout from this is going to be horrendous.
I think it is. Again, I just get really nervous when legislatures get involved with this kind of thing, when they don't have the experience or the training and relying on their own experts. I think there's 2 things that are driving it. One of them is, you said, the money, and that's the worldview of expediency, of let's not drain our coffers and so forth and so on. And that's a secular worldview. But then I believe that there is a invisible worldview that is also driving this, and that is to corrupt life. That is and it started, you go back there and if you haven't, to your viewers, if you haven't take a look at it, go back and just look at Francis Schaeffer and C. Everett Koop talking about whatever happened to the human race. When you start expediency in the term of expediency, and as President Obama said, you don't want to penalize children for making a mistake by allowing them to bring a baby in the world. And that's what the President of the United States said, that he didn't want his daughter penalized by having a baby if she made a mistake. When you start looking at life as a penalty, when you start looking at life from that worldview, how many steps does it take to get to the point where you're saying, okay, it's time for them to check out? We're done. This is too much. This is a penalty. I don't want to penalize my family by bringing a child into the world. That's a quote from the president. I don't know if you remember hearing him say that, but that's a quote when they asked about this. I don't want to penalize my family by making them having to care for somebody with such and such.
Well,
these are tough issues. But as believers, if we're not leading this conversation topic, then who's going to?
I completely agree with you, and that's exactly why we have the Caregivers Hour every month to talk about and bring focus, bring a spotlight. If between your radio programs, our television feature program, which features the Caregivers Hour every month, does not bring some kind of help and focus on this, the ability to take this particular video, when we upload it to YouTube, I want to challenge our entire audience to send it to your congressman. Send it to your state representative. Send it to your governor. Tell them how you feel about how this is not something that you are supporting, something that you have tremendous questions about. If you're in a state which is considering this legislation, think about the caregiver, not just the person being taken care of, and start looking at what the fallout from this would be if you were to sit there with your beloved mother, you who just spent, we had many pieces of correspondence back and forth while you were there with your mom in the hospital, tending to her needs, and imagine if you were to have succumbed to the administration of some lethal dose of medication. Sitting here today thinking about how you were responsible for your mother's death, and an announcement comes through that there was a breakthrough surgery uncovered in some country and she qualified, or the letter came that the trial that she was you hadn't heard from, all of a sudden you get a notification that she's been approved for an experimental treatment, and you've gone ahead and administered that.
I love the fact that we just passed the Right to Try Act. Did you see that?
Yes, absolutely. And so this is it. But unfortunately, we're out of time. Always a sterling conversation with you, my friend. Take this video. Let's grab it, put it up on Standing with Hope, Caregivers with Hope. Let us get this message out there and get people talking and thinking. If you and I can be just a catalyst, we're not going to change the world, but if you and I can be a catalyst, then maybe, just maybe, if we do our part, then we can call others to do theirs. God bless you, my friend, Peter Rosenberger. StandingWithHope.com and HopeForCaregivers.com. God bless you, my friend. We'll see you next month. Shalom. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll bring you the next edition of Revealing the Truth.